All right, I guess in the interest of time, we shall begin. My name is Lisa Sipenko, head Consilium Scientific, and today is our last event of the year. And we have a distinguished all-American panel for you to talk about the FDA and why it's failing the public with its questionable approvals of cancer and Alzheimer's drugs. But we also have a treat for you that we'll be talking about a bit wider aspects and not just covering cancer and Alzheimer's, but also looking at other diseases. So I would like to introduce our chair, Peter Whitehouse, who is a professor of neurology from Case Western University. And Peter, I'm handing this to you to lead the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Great to be with you and everybody else on the panel. This is not only the last of Consilium Scientific's wonderful work this year, it's the last of three, and the recordings are available for those of you that are interested. And a panel that John Hickman, and who's in the audience, and I and others put together with Lisa on looking at the parallels between drug development in cancer and Alzheimer's disease. And the special treat is we have an expert on infectious diseases, so we'll expand our horizons this morning and this evening, wherever you are. So welcome. We're going to start by making brief introductions. Our bios are available online, and what brings us here. So we're going to do that first. Just take a few minutes to do that. Then we're going to talk about a series of cases, some drug approvals, which we think raise general issues, and we will see common elements across those cases. We'll end by our thoughts about how we could make some differences in perhaps not just the FDA, but the system in which the FDA is embedded in our society. And finally, open it up to some questions from you all. That process will involve, if you want to put comments in the chat, Lisa and I will be monitoring the chat. But what we'll do in the last 10 minutes or so is bring you up on stage to ask your question live if you have any. So I'm a geriatric neurologist. I was involved, I'll just give my introduction while I've got the podium, involved in the first line of Alzheimer's drugs, the cholinesterase inhibitors, based on basic science work I did at Hopkins. Actually, this is an American conversation, but I did work on harmonization of drug guidelines across different regulatory bodies. And I think one of the sadnesses for me working internationally is that the FDA used to be on the pinnacle. Everybody would look to the FDA as a model for how other systems should consider drug approvals. And I think it's lost some of its panache. And finally wrote an article on one of the recent drugs that Joel's going to talk about in the Alzheimer's area, very critical of the FDA's behavior in that space. So that's me, and that's why I'm here. And Joel, please give your introduction and why you're here, and we'll then have you lead off with the cases once we've done all the introductions.
Thank you. So I'm Joel Perlman. I'm a professor at Washington University in St. Louis. I've been there 45 years. I'm also professor of radiology and neuroscience. My major research focus, which has been NIH funded for nearly 40 years, is biomarker development. My clinical expertise is really, I headed the movement disorders group with Parkinson's, and I did a lot of research also in Parkinson's disease and related and dementia associated with that. I'm here because I served on the Peripheral Advisory Committee for FDA. I served on it for 6 years, and I was a member of the committee that reviewed aducanumab and its application. And in addition to that, I had participated, I was a collaborator and a co-author of a monograph from the Institute of Medicine on conflict of interest in clinical research, care, and education.
Thank you, Joel. Tito.
I'm Tito Flo. I'm a medical oncologist at Columbia University, New York. I spent 32 years at the National Cancer Institute. It was there that I got interested in drug development of cancer drugs, and watched it over my career sort of go from a NCI-oriented enterprise to an industry-oriented enterprise. And many changes that have occurred have been of concern to me, and that's why I'm interested in this topic as a whole.
Thank you. John.
Thanks, Peter. I'm an internal medicine and infectious diseases physician. I spent a decade at FDA as the lead medical officer for antimicrobial development. And now I'm a professor of clinical medicine at George Washington University School of Medicine here in Washington, D.C.
Excellent. So I think you can see we have a broad panel with interests in different diseases and different professional backgrounds, and also experiences with the FDA and other relevant bodies. So let's launch into our case studies. We're going to do this with Joel presenting first about aducanumab, in fact, the drug he mentioned that he and I have been involved in. Tito talking about a particular class of cancer drugs and what we've learned from those, and then John talking about infectious diseases and antibiotics specifically. So if we can take about 3 or 4 minutes on each of those, that would be great, and then we'll come around to some general discussion before we interact with the audience. Joel, please lead us off.
Thank you. So I had served on the FDA committee for about 6 years. And then in November of 2021, we convened a panel to review the application for Biogen for aducanumab. This was a very unusual type of a review committee because this drug, which had been through 2 major phase 3 trials that were kind of combined, had been stopped for futility prior to this application. And then at this particular meeting, and this was different from usual meetings, because usually we have the company present, the FDA then presents independently, and then there are comments from the review committee, and then the public is invited to make comments, and then everybody discusses. What was very different and raised eyebrows from people on the committee at the time, even though it was by Zoom, is the FDA and Biogen presented together. And that was very unusual. And they selectively took part of the data that was accumulated and said, let's look at half the data that seemed like it provided clinical benefit, and we'll ignore the other half of the data. And it was very surprising. And then they asked us questions, would you approve? And the way the questions were posed seemed quite biased in their perspective. Specifically, they also had done measurements of amyloid A beta in the brain with PET imaging, because it was thought that that could be a biomarker for Alzheimer's disease, because people with Alzheimer's disease have abnormal A beta in their brain. But the fact of whether that was relevant for the pathogenesis of the clinical manifestations of dementia had not been proven. At the particular review committee, one of the members of the committee specifically asked whether they were using that biomarker of reduction of A beta amyloid, which was done in a subset of the people, as a measure of efficacy. And they specifically said, no, we're not doing that. And that was particularly relevant because the FDA's own independent biostatistician gave a talk at that meeting saying there was no evidence that there was a relationship between change in that biomarker and clinical outcome. So this was very strange. So they were really, the FDA and Biogen together were trying to look at retrospectively of some data. And what really struck me in particular of this is the head of the FDA in charge of this area had previously ingrained into us that in a prospective study, if you look back retrospectively at subgroups and you found a subgroup that had a clinical benefit, that was a great way to pose a hypothesis, but needed to be tested in a prospective study, and it was rarely proven to be true. That was his own very words. In this case, they were doing exactly that without the prospective study. So at the end of this meeting, when there was a call for a vote on approval of aducanumab, none of the 11 members of the committee voted to approve, 10 approved to deny it, and 1 abstained. Nevertheless, 6 months later, without coming back to the committee, the FDA decided that they were going to give accelerated approval for aducanumab based on the biomarker data of the PET imaging, which is what they specifically said they weren't doing at the advisory committee meeting, and specifically the biostatistician from the FDA said did not provide evidence for that. So there's major concerns, and within 15 minutes of hearing that, I resigned. And I was very concerned about the interactions between Biogen and the FDA, about funding of the FDA, and there are a whole host of other issues. But the bottom line is they ignored the substantial number of side effects from this drug, which were really cast in a very minimalistic way, with 35% of people getting focal edema in their brain and 20% having little microhemorrhages with marginal, if any, clinical benefit. So the risk-benefit ratio did not seem to make sense. And this raised many questions for why this drug was getting accelerated approval and the huge, enormous cost that Biogen had initially proposed for this drug. It just did not seem to make sense. And then subsequently, a couple of other members of the committee resigned on that basis as well. And maybe I'll hold it there and we can go into greater detail.
Absolutely. And since I was involved in this process, let me just add a couple of things. Three members of the committee resigned, including Aaron Kesselheim, who spoke in our first part of this series, a fellow at Harvard who is one of the more knowledgeable people, not present company accepted, about drug regulatory processes. The other thing is I think it's four of the FDA people involved, including the lead person, that we won't mention by name, went to work for industry. So the revolving door occurred. And some of you were frozen. Is my internet okay? Can you hear me? Okay,
We can
great.
hear you.
Thank you. And finally, I'm sorry to add to your excellent presentation, Joel, but the Alzheimer's Association, which has grown enormously in power, is constantly promising, as late as in the early 2020, that we'd have a cure or an end by 2025. And this pressure to bring a drug out almost without enough concern about either efficacy or safety, I think is we have to look at the role of lay groups, which certainly played an important role when I was on the committee, but not like it did this time. So anyway, that was my addition to Joel's case. I promise I won't do that to Tito or John. So Tito, you're next up. What do you want to tell us about in the cancer field?
So as we discussed briefly earlier, so I think that the FDA obviously can be better. Everybody can be better. We can all be better, and the FDA could be better. But I think that the problem is broader than the FDA. But looking at the FDA, so recently we published an article looking at accelerated approvals that had been rescinded. And what did those tell us about the FDA? What does it tell us about the process? And I think it's interesting. So my wife always tells me, you shouldn't say this because it just shows your age. But when I started in medicine, who made the diagnosis of appendicitis? The doctor at the bedside, right? And we were all told, if somebody tells you every patient that I take to surgery has appendicitis, I'm the greatest clinician, you actually were not the greatest clinician. You have to take it and be about 20% of the patients should have a normal appendix. If you wait until they had appendicitis, you were waiting too long. So I think in a way that applies to the FDA. We don't want the FDA to have approved 100% accuracy of their drugs. We actually want them to make mistakes. Because if they're not making mistakes, then you start to wonder, what have we missed? But then once you make a mistake, what do? So they've got in place the process by which you can rescind the drug approval. But that is one thing that I think they don't do quite as well as they could. And there's some drugs, and a lot has been written about this, that just keep going and going and going. And the FDA doesn't demand that the confirmatory trials be done. I think they could do a lot better in that regard. When you look at these episodes of rescinding, so you realize part of it is also not the FDA. Half of them were immunotherapy drugs. And what had happened, they came onto the market. Everybody was sure now we were going to cure cancer by just turning your immune system on cancer. The enthusiasm was overwhelming. They gave these to patients, and they had response rates in the low teens. Nothing else had been given, so you said, this drug works. Look, I mean, had we given a placebo, we would have seen zero. The fact that it's 12, 13, 15 tells us that these drugs work. When then the FDA said, well, you've given chemotherapy in the past, can you go head to head against chemotherapy? It turned out that they didn't do so well, right? And in fact, if you look at most of those in the randomization who got the immunotherapy died sooner than those who got chemotherapy. Eventually, there seemed to be a little advantage to the immunotherapy, but you'd have to take the risk of, I have a 50 to 60% chance of dying sooner. And if I don't, if I'm in that 40% that does, I may have a little bit of benefit. So why did this happen? Because it was this exuberance over drug development that has become a problem. And the FDA acknowledged this recently with sotorasib in lung cancer, where it's just an exuberance that takes over the physicians and the patients, and is driven in large part by industry and some of the groups such as the Alzheimer's Association that you mentioned, that then leads to improper science being done. So I think that the FDA can get better. I think one of the things that can be improved is being more diligent in ensuring that confirmatory trials are done. But I don't think that we want an FDA that is free of errors. We want there to be some errors. We just want those to be correctable. And so I'll stop there for now, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of these issues. You're muted, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sure we'll come back to some of these issues, including the issues of what we should do differently, and the big system issues that you brought us in attention to. John, infectious disease,
Thanks.
antibiotics.
Thanks, Peter. So I asked Peter and Lisa to discuss this because for many of the issues that we're talking about today, the infectious disease area has been kind of the canary in the coal mine for many of these issues. So Tito was talking about the usage of laboratory measures or other indirect measures as outcomes in these trials, instead of direct patient outcomes like survival or improving patient symptoms or function in their lives. So the first place that was done was in HIV trials in the 1990s. And in fact, the regulations were changed to allow FDA to approve a drug based on only a laboratory measure back in the 1990s, based on the infectious disease area. The other issue is that since many infections are shorter term, they're acute illnesses, that many of these kinds of faster approvals are test driven in the infectious disease space, and then, and if I can use a pun, metastasize to other areas like cancer or neurology. So I wanted to talk about one of the issues is that FDA sometimes doesn't follow their own rules. There was a BMJ publication last year which talked about a new antibiotic called Ricarbrio. Ricarbrio is an older drug called imipenem that has been available for over 30 years and used widely by clinicians. Ricarbrio is a combination of imipenem plus a newer drug called relebactam. That makes logical sense that if you're combining a new drug with an old drug and comparing it to that same old drug, it should improve patient outcomes. The design of the trial was to allow the new drug to be up to 15% worse than the older drug. So that doesn't even make logical scientific sense, and also raises some ethical questions about why would anybody ever sign up for a trial where the outcomes could be 1 in 6 people do worse than if they got the same old drug they could have gotten for the last 30 years. The results of that trial came out showing that the new drug might worsen patient outcomes by up to 21%. So this is a failed trial. The FDA approved it anyway, based on the idea that, well, we know imipenem's been around for a long time and it works. Well, that's kind of irrelevant to knowing whether the combination improves outcomes over the older, less expensive drug. This new drug also was almost 10 to 100 times more expensive than the older drug imipenem by itself. Then when asked about this by the BMJ, the FDA also in its own review said that the drug did not meet the criteria for substantial evidence, which is what the law says a drug has to do to be approved. So that's the issue where the BMJ brought up, was the FDA even following its own rules. When questioned by the BMJ, the FDA said that they approved it because the older drug worked in the test tube and worked in animal models. That's very interesting because the entire genesis of the current FDA regulations was based on, again, an infectious disease example of a drug called Panalba that was used in the 1950s. The company was marketing it based on test tube data and animal models. And the courts said that FDA was not empowered to approve drugs based on test tube data and animal models, and that they had to show that it benefited actual patients with disease. So it almost seems like we've come full circle over 60 years that the anti-infective section at FDA is now approving drugs based on test tube data instead of their benefits in the patients who would actually use those drugs in practice. So we then did a study where we went out and we interviewed patients with infections and said, would you sign up for a study where the FDA allowed the new drug to be only 10% worse? So 51% of respondents said, no way would I sign up for that trial, no matter what else. The other 40% said, well, it depends what other benefits the drug might have, like if it had less side effects, et cetera, which Ricarbrio did not, by the way. And then the other percentage of people said something I thought was even the most concerning. They'd sign up for it if their doctor told them to. So that gets to what Tito was saying, is there's other players in this area, including the investigators in these trials. How are the ethics boards, the institutional review boards, approving these studies to begin with? And what is the role of advisory committees, patient advocacy groups, and medical societies, which have conflicts of interest, on pressuring FDA to approve more drugs, but not better drugs? The FDA's mission statement actually says advancing public health. Doesn't say keeping it the same. It doesn't say allowing it to be 15% worse. It says advancing, which means improving patient outcomes. And I think we're going to talk some more today about what are the downsides of doing things this way in terms of not just the monetary ones, but the incentives to develop drugs that don't help people and sort of put people, drugs developers down the rabbit hole of developing drugs that don't help people because they've been told that their product's going to get approved. Let me stop there, Peter. Turn it back to you.
Well, thank you, everybody. I think we've all identified that there are systems issues above and beyond the FDA. For example, I work a lot on public health and environment, and what's happening at the EPA is another good example of the general phenomena of regulatory capture. And also in terms of competing priorities about how we could really help patients. But let's return to the question, is the FDA failing the public? And to the goal of this three-part series, which is to see what we can learn across fields that might be helpful to coming up with some picture about differences that we could make for medicine as a whole. And that's why actually, John, fortuitously, and thank you for being persistent advocate for your area, you were the canary in the coal mine. I mean, infectious diseases were, I think, for some of us, a relatively easier target. Obviously, I'm not an expert, so that's probably, but we've got chronic diseases now, of which Alzheimer's and Parkinson's are, and cancers are there in the inner space. But so how do we deal with a world where the health issues are changing, and what can we learn? Maybe let's start with you. What do you think the other fields, of which you obviously have some familiarity, can learn from infectious disease?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we were all talking about before we came on today was I think that it's actually a very pernicious thing, and that is the emotional argument of people are desperate. The FDA has now taken, to their credit, to publishing some explanatory pieces about why they approve some of these drugs in the medical journals. There was one that was published recently in the Journal of Infectious Diseases, and it said that there's an unmet medical need for new drugs. I actually thought that statement was false. There's not a medical need for new drugs. There's a medical need for drugs that improve patient outcomes. I don't care if the drug's new, old, or in between, whether it's a repurposed old drug, as long as it improves patient outcomes. And what seems to me is getting lost in here is the patients. As a person who still sees sick patients, I think this sort of violates the basic premise of medicine. This is not an emotional argument of, I have to do something. It should be first, do no harm. It is not my job to give people something that hasn't been demonstrated to be safe and effective in the kinds of patients that I'm going to give it to in practice. That puts me in a bad spot, and it puts my patients in an even worse spot of not even knowing whether this stuff is going to be beneficial. Putting aside the bigger issues of how much this is actually costing the system, and as I said earlier, the terrible incentive to tell people to develop more of these drugs in the same way. So I think we need to get beyond the emotional arguments of saying, well, people are desperate. In fact, I think it's unethical to take advantage of desperate people by offering them things that haven't been demonstrated to be beneficial for them.
And I'd like to follow up on that point, because I think what we saw with aducanumab was the Alzheimer's societies, which is, and largely you have to look at where they're getting their funding. They accused me of being not caring about these people with Alzheimer's disease, for which it's an incurable disease. And I look upon the FDA, and particularly the advisory committees, or expertise, is to protect vulnerable populations. We want to identify new treatments that can be beneficial, as John is saying, and we have to make sure that the risk benefit is appropriate, and we have to be careful about that rather than succumbing to the emotional pressures on members of the committee, on the FDA also. And the question is, where is that being driven? It's from societies. How are the societies being funded? The pressure from pharma directly, which brings to the point, how is the FDA funded? And that's a big issue. So if you look at the FDA, what funds the FDA, human drugs, when you look at and FDA has broken that down into categories, human drugs are funded 65% by fees from companies. Whereas if you look at foods that the FDA regulates, less than 1% comes from applicant companies. And that's a huge potential conflict that can definitely bias the issue. Also, who is reviewing these things, and how's the influence on the members of committees, when committees are even convened? This is another issue. So I think we have to look at this really carefully. And there's more than just conflict of interest of money. There's also researchers and investigators who are invested in particular hypotheses and want their hypotheses to be true and push it like crazy. And when you go to look at biomarkers that are acting as surrogate endpoints, you have to carefully assess whether that biomarker can predict clinical outcome. Otherwise, it shouldn't be used. And in the case of aducanumab with amyloid reduction, that was a leap of faith. That the hypothesis was based upon a very small percentage, less than 1% of people with Alzheimer's that have a genetic form of Alzheimer's. And so that's a real problem.
And so, Tito, your hand is up. I'm going to recognize you. The Alzheimer's Association specifically wanted to make the world more afraid of Alzheimer's than cancer. They've often set cancer as the model for what they want to do, including the money they want to get for research. So it's another example of the fear and the emotionality, and how people thought cancer was a leading field for producing fear. But that may not be what you said, but what you wanted to say. But the parallels there, I think, are interesting. What would you like to contribute? You're muted.
What I was going to add to that is the fact that, the FDA, or at least the oncology division, believes that their job is to approve drugs, and then they leave it to us, the general academic community, shall we say, to then guide how those drugs are used. Actually, I don't know that that's the FDA. That's certainly how Rick Pastor thinks about it. They approve the drugs, and then we're supposed to guide their use. And the problem is that gets complicated. Like, for example, the NCCN, which is the National Cooperative Cancer Network guidelines that everybody uses. I always tell the patient, our fellows, they're not guidelines, they're opinions. Guidelines has more of a halo around it. These are the opinions of the people that are in the committee. And then it's become even more of a problem because if you want the drug to be approved by your insurance company or by the patient's insurance company, having it on the NCCN guidelines is very valuable. So all of a sudden, really, drugs and indications that aren't so valuable are getting put on there so that you can get insurance approvals. And so what you have is you have the FDA approving drugs that aren't so good. And by the way, that's just because we brought them drugs that aren't so good. And that's also because cancer is so difficult. You know, the average, I just finished an analysis or about to finish it. You know, the immunotherapy, the median benefit in overall survival was just barely 3 months. So it should have been more than that, but cancer is difficult. So the FDA ends up approving these drugs, and then we're supposed to provide guidance, but we can't, and we don't do the proper studies. And then you push them to get on the NCCN guidelines so that insurance companies can approve it. It starts to become a very difficult problem that involves a lot of people.
Can I just,
Can I, what Tito was saying? I was watching a YouTube video recently of Milton Friedman from the 1970s arguing why we don't need an FDA. And his reasoning was because doctors will quickly figure out what works and what doesn't. I turned to my wife and I said, if only that was true. I said, it's actually incredibly challenging, especially in very sick people, for us to figure out what works and what doesn't, which is why the rise of randomized clinical trials occurred in the 1940s, which when you think about it, is a drop in the bucket in the history of medicine from 1940 till now. So FDA serves a really useful purpose in giving to me and my patients the information we need. And it should be there to tell us it works before we use it. And I agree with Tito. What's happened is the opposite. We'll put it out there and we'll let God figure it out. And that puts us in a bad spot as both clinicians and patients.
so,
We look to the FDA for approved drugs. That's what clinicians do. They're looking to the FDA for their expert review.
There was a cartoon in the New Yorker that said, this drug is FDA approved. And in little writing at the bottom said, warning, this drug is FDA approved. That's not the position we should be in.
Right.
well, Milton Friedman is an economist, and he believed that human beings were rational, to go back to our rational actors. Let me kind of just build on a comment you made about the role of the profession more generally, because the issue of guidelines from professional societies is really important, and it raises another ethical issue. I have watched the development of guidelines in the Alzheimer's field to the point of incredulity. The last efforts by the Alzheimer's Association, the National Institute of Aging actually removed their name from to push biomarkers. But the problem with guidelines is they often don't discriminate research and clinical guidelines. And this is another violation of Helsinki and others, that you really have two roles. You have a clinical role, as always have had or do have, and you have a researcher role. And when you start merging those together, I think you get into the emotional. That's my doctor recommending that kind of thing. I think Joel said that. Do you have a comment about any further comments about the role of professional societies? And let me just say there are a couple of really interesting comments in the chat that I'm going to call on folks. I wanted to call on John Hickman, not right yet. We're not quite finished. We have maybe 5 or 10 more minutes of discussion to talk about that paper that he put in the chat that he had shared with this group beforehand about people's attitudes about speed of approval. And Joel, maybe you'd be interested in making a comment about regulatory capture. You end with a very interesting statement. Government is not captured by industry. It's an active participant with corporations. But anyway, so that's just if you guys are interested in both guys, prepare yourself for a few minutes to give a brief comment. And
the guideline thing, Peter, extends to advisory committees. So I point out all the time that the very first section of the Belmont report on the ethics of clinical research makes the distinction between clinical practice, which is trying to benefit an individual, and clinical research, which is testing hypotheses. I agree those get confused. I spent a decade at the FDA, and I still remember the first advisory committee I went to scratching my head going, these guys are talking about whether they would use the drug in an individual patient. That's not the question. The question is, does this evidence reach the standard of substantial evidence that's outlined in the law and regulation? And I found that constantly getting confused by advisory committee members as well. I've come to sort of understand that I think part of that confusion's purposeful, right? That a lot of these drugs don't meet the substantial evidence requirement. So you fall back on some emotional argument about would I use this in a desperate person? I always turn to my wife and I say, boy, I wouldn't go to that dude if I was sick. Because if that's the level of evidence you're using to do patient care, that's an issue too. But let me let the other guys talk.
Right. So there is a substantial issue with who is pushing, who is on an advisory committee, and what are their biases. So I'm told that, so in some cases, advisory committees are devoid of members that have conflict of interest or relationships with the company applying. That's actually the minority, I believe. That was true on the Adjuvant committee, but not many others. And it turns out, and there's a nice paper looking at how different members of the committee vote depending upon their relationships. And if they have a relationship with either the company that's applying or a competing company, they're less likely to disapprove of a drug with marginal evidence. So this is a real problem. But furthermore, what is even the role of advisory committees? How does the FDA take their opinions into consideration? There's no necessary relationship. So we're always told that we want to have committee members that are experts, and only the experts are the ones that are involved with this drug, and that's just not true. So there could be better review of these drugs, looking at exactly what John's talking about. Does this drug really, is there evidence that this drug is efficacious and better than what's currently out there? And that's not consistently done at all right now. And there's huge pressure, and I think the pressure really reflects the influence of companies on societies, on FDA members, the fluidity between members of the FDA and subsequent industry, how people change. And that's a real problem in adjudicating these kinds of decisions and determining what are proper endpoints. We have to have good clinical endpoints, and this is another major issue.
So, Tito, let me see if you have anything to add to this particular part of the conversation, then remind us all that we're supposed to end up our part by giving one example of, or with all the things, all the levers that you might want to implement in this complicated system. Where would you like to see us focus our attention on making changes? And you're allowed to say, you know, something besides the FDA, but we've all agreed the FDA is a critical part of this. Tito, do you have a comment? You're muted again, sorry.
So I'm not quite sure that this is what you want to hear, but I think a key thing is that anything that comes to the FDA, every bit of data that went to the FDA should be made public. And the FDA, I don't know where they get this, that they say, no, we can't do that because of the law. I want to know what that law is, and we need to have that law changed immediately. You know, I know pharmaceutical industries don't want you to see that data, and we know that's why. But the FDA should allow us to see that data. And then we can critically assess it alongside the FDA. And the FDA should say, I'm not afraid you're going to find something I didn't. Here it is. Let's have it. And I think that that's one thing that would improve the FDA enormously, if they also knew that others are going to look at this data.
Can I follow up with just a brief comment about that? Because I totally agree. One of the things the FDA makes decisions, it's in isolation, each decision. It's not like case law where you build up a record. You can go back to case law and make decisions based upon previous cases. The FDA doesn't even have a reasonable database to go back and look at past decisions and what's been done. This is a huge problem. And so everything is a one-off. And that's very archaic approach.
Yeah.
And Joel, I've been in situations where I was working on something from this side, and when the FDA reviewer changed, their entire comments about the application changed. That shouldn't happen, right? There should be a consistent standard of evidence. I want to reinforce what Tito said. There is nothing in law or regulation which says FDA cannot release that. That is a policy choice by the senior managers at FDA, and that needs to change. We need to get people in there who agree that transparency means getting that information out. I've been doing this a long time, and when I come on service, I always say to the fellows, you know what? I'm going to try to teach you something, but you're going to teach me something too. We shouldn't be afraid to learn from other people. And if you aren't, then what's the harm in letting other people analyze that and having a debate if you think they analyzed it the wrong way?
The issue of disclosure and transparency, I think, is key. Lots of progress there. And also the whole issue of negative studies. I mean, there are people who, donate their bodies to science or whatever might if they participate in trials, and the industry controls whether too far a degree whether that data, the negative data, is shown. Let me. I think we've all made a few comments about what we would like to see happen. Let me invite a few comments from the audience. And as I mentioned, John Hickman was one of the organizers of this and had communicated with us, I think, just this morning. John, you put a comment in the chat. Would you like to bring that forward into the conversation space by unmuting and perhaps turning on your camera?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Yeah, and thank you to the panel. It's a great discussion. So I stumbled over this paper in Lancet Oncology from authors at the London School of Economics. And what they did, I think, was interesting, was to educate patients and people around patients about the difference between surrogate endpoints, particularly progression-free survival, and overall survival, and what that meant. And I suppose it's striking but not surprising that many patients and those around them didn't know the difference between those two things, and the fact that drugs were largely being approved on surrogate endpoints. And the bottom line of this study, looking at a lot of people, I've summarized there that the respondents very positively expressed preference for increased overall survival, even at the cost of delayed access to new cancer drugs. So this is a very interesting point, that the patients themselves do not want these drugs that do not work. And in the case of cancer, of the approved drugs, I think for the last 7 years or so, only 30% of them have a significant effect, and only 10% of those actually increase survival. All the rest have no effect. So here's the patient. So I think it comes down maybe to educating patients a lot more through patients' associations, who unfortunately are supported by the drug industry. But if we could free ourselves up from that, we might come to the conclusion that this paper came to.
Thank you, John. Comments from the panel? Clearly expressed. So let me just say there are a couple of comments in the chat about the transition in government in the United States. And having just read Dr. McCarry's biography, and his several books he's written, there's clearly some sympathies in his view, and so let's hope that we work together to make some changes under his presumed, although not for sure, appointment as the FDA director. And in that spirit, Joel, would you like to come forward and say anything in the conversation space about your comment about regulatory capture and beyond? Are you available to do that?
Sure. Well,
The other Joel, Joel Lesson. You're welcome to comment, Joel Perlmutter, in just a minute, but Joel may not be able to come forward.
Nope.
So you there?
I'm here.
Okay.
Yep.
Go ahead, sir.
So thanks for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed listening to the discussion. But I think, as I wrote in the commentary, and that regulatory capture is too narrow a way of looking at this, that assumes that the regulations were put in place with good intent, and that industry has taken over the regulator, when in fact, at least for the past 40 years under neoliberalism, I think that what we've seen is that the government and industry are working together um, to develop the regulations. And this government is not being taken advantage of, not government is not being captured. Government is actively working with the industry to advance the industry's positions. And I think if you don't take that kind of view, then you get to the point where you think that piecemeal changes are going to make a significant difference. And while these piecemeal changes may be necessary, they're certainly not sufficient. So there are a couple of examples to bring up. So one is the open payments database in the United States, where you can see who's made, which companies have made payments of $10 or more to physicians. That's been a boon for researchers to be able to look at how much money people have gotten and their changes in their prescribing behavior, but it hasn't made a whit of difference in how the companies interact with physicians, or the reverse, how physicians interact with companies. Here in Canada, since 2018, Health Canada, with very minor redactions, has been releasing full clinical study reports about drugs. So all of the information that companies submit to Health Canada when they're applying to get a new drug approved has been released. Usually it takes about 6 months to do that, but it hasn't made any difference in how Health Canada has behaved. In fact, Health Canada, in my view, is becoming more supportive of industry and loosening its regulations. So I think we need to look at things from a much larger perspective to be able to realize what needs to be done in order to make significant changes. Thanks.
I think a number of people have expressed that, and thanks for bringing Canada into the equation. I just sent a message to David Healy, who I see has his visage on screen, to invite a comment. David can introduce many factors, not the least of which is the whole field of psychiatry. So we've left 5 minutes at the end of the hour for a discussion on psychiatry. David, you want to make any comment?
Well, Peter, yes. Just quickly, I take a different view to the main view we've been hearing, but one that I think Tito brought out, which is the people who are failing us. I'm not muted, but
Louder, David. You have to speak. Turn your mic up or something.
I'm not quite sure what's going on. Let me just change my
That's
headset.
better. That's better when you got closer.
Okay.
Yeah, just put
Sorry
your
about
nose to the microphone.
Okay. Yes, I think one of the big issues is that people are misunderstanding what FDA are. They're a bureaucracy. They're not in the business of trying to improve health as such, other than looking at the wording of adverts in order to see that
they care about false claims, but they're not actually doing science. They're looking at paperwork, and they agree with industry about the standards that industry has to meet, which is often a surrogate marker standard. That's agreed with industry, and once industry reach that standard, FDA have to approve the drug even if it's inferior. Their view, as Tito I think said, was it's really up to the rest of medicine to work out what they're going to do with these drugs that are approved. And the idea that we're looking to FDA to tell us how best to use these drugs is nuts. It really should be medicine that's working out how best to use these drugs and which are the drugs that really count. I think, as I say, I think the people that are failing us are doctors, And we're about to go out of business because if the drugs we have are so good, and that's across the board, mental health, cancer drugs, whatever, if they're as good as is claimed and as free of problems as is claimed, doctors are going to be replaced by physicians associates and nurse consultants who will prescribe these drugs much cheaper.
Could I add on to what David said? I'm often asked, if you could have one thing like in a perfect world wish list, what would you ask for? And I have to say, top of my list is that FDA should have a relative efficacy standard, that new drugs should be better in some way, either more efficacious, less toxic, more convenient than what we have already. But for the most part, FDA has claimed as far back as the 90s, they don't have a relative efficacy standard, except in two situations: serious and life-threatening diseases and contagious diseases that already have effective therapies. They don't pay attention to that either, because what I explained with the drug that I talked about was a serious and life-threatening illness that's contagious where they allowed a new drug to be worse. So even in the places where they do have a relative efficacy standard, they're not enforcing it. But in terms of society, why do we need a new drug that doesn't benefit some population? And I've heard people say, well, the reason why we need those drugs is because that'll lower the cost of medicine. No, it hasn't, right? When the new drug comes out, it's almost universally more expensive than the older one, even if it's not better in any way. So it's not addressing cost either. It would if the market works by supply and demand, but because of exclusivities and patent extensions, it doesn't work as a free market economy.
Sure, but John, it should be doctors who are working out where these drugs stand. I mean, there's relative efficacy in the sense of, you know, the drug that treats your back pain may be an analgesic drug. The drug that treats mine might be an antibiotic. You don't want to get rid of the antibiotic for back pain for the small number of people where it's caused by an infection. So we don't want drugs removed from the market, which means there's going to be a wide range of drugs. Some will be much better for more people, but there'll be a group of people for whom this drug that isn't particularly effective might be the best drug, but it's up to doctors to work that out. It's not up to bureaucrats.
Right. And I think who ends up funding that? So for instance, I'll give you an example, David. The Veterans Administration funded a trial that looked at an old diuretic for high blood pressure versus some of these newer drugs. The old one worked better, right?
Yeah.
Who paid for that trial? We did, right? Taxpayers' dollars ended up paying for that.
Of course, and we as the people who should best be able to inform the taxpayers should have a much louder voice in this. We should be able to tell the public and tell politicians that, you know, we figure these drugs are over costly, and if we could get to see the data, I agree with the point about we should be able to see the data. If we get to see the data, we could say we're not going to prescribe it unless the cost drops. We have a soul to sell. We should be selling it at a higher price.
But that doesn't work. And that doesn't work because individual physicians, first of all, may not have the breadth of knowledge nor the voice to make themselves heard. So that's why it's helpful if we had an FDA that actually provided
but
proper
not bureaucrats. They're not going to do it. A professional medical body, not the individual doctor, but it's not going to be FDA. That's not their job.
They're doing very well moderating this until I invited David, which is not surprising. Not a moderating person. I just to briefly comment, we're asking whether the FDA is failing the public, or a couple of comments in the chat. We need a more informed public too, because I'm frankly a bit hesitant to put too much power. For example, there are lots of things you can do about pain that don't involve doctors, and perhaps we should be spending more money on those kind of public health interventions. But I also saw a pretty face. So, sorry, that's probably an inappropriate comment, but Lisa, come online, which may be a signal that we have to turn our attention to other matters. Lisa, are we turning ourselves back to you now?
No, I think it's a fantastic discussion. So Peter, if you would like to maybe ask participants to make final statements or conclusions or wishes for the future.
Yes, I think we've been doing a fair amount of this to go along, but everybody, we've got just 2 minutes before the end of the hour. And Lisa, you have a couple of announcements to make. So 30 seconds. Any final comments, wrap-up comments?
I think, Peter, you said we needed solutions. I'm going to give three. We need transparency, like what Tito said. We need accountability, that when people don't follow the rules there, that they be held accountable for it, not end up with a high-paying job in industry. And we need to make sure that FDA follows its own scientific rules so that we get the information that we need for patients and doctors.
Good model, 3 and 25 seconds. Joel.
I would make a comment that I love all those ideas from John, but it's not going to happen unless we fully fund the FDA from Congress. And we can't have industry cover the bulk of the price for adjudicating human drugs.
Thank you. Tito, last comment.
Muted again.
The FDA can get better, but I think the overall scientific community, academicians, and also industry have an enormous amount more to do than the FDA. That's my feeling. We're failing.
We do. We need more attention to this in the medical media. So George Perry, there's some work here to be done with the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, I think. Okay, well, Lisa, I think we're at the time. So why don't you wish everybody, as I will, Happy New Year, and look forward to seeing Consilium Scientific in 2025.
Peter, thank you so much for chairing an absolutely excellent panel. Huge thank you to Joel, Tito, and John for your expertise and absolutely fascinating discussion. I think everyone in our audience will agree it was one of our most interesting events. We all learned a lot. And we're not ending on a very positive note in terms of where things are with the FDA, and we're facing kind of uncertain future with the new government. We're just here to see what is happening, and Consilium will be continuing the events, perhaps in the space, commenting from other experts, perhaps seeing you back. So thank you very, very much. A very important conversation. This is the end of the year, so I do wish everyone very happy holidays. We are coming back in Consilium with the next event on the 16th of January. We look forward to seeing you. The next year program is already pretty full and packed with very exciting topics and events. So thank you so much to everyone and enjoy the break. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.